Hello, my name is Vicky O'Shea, and this is episode 57 of A Wealthy Life. And today we're going to be discussing the difference between strategy versus technique and asking you the question, do you know the difference? And more importantly, why do you need to know the difference? And one of the first things I would say to you is that the language of property investment is very specific. It uses ordinary words, but they often have meanings behind them when put together in certain ways. And one of the things that we do in property is we talk about property strategies. And that's wrong. They're not property strategies. They are property techniques. Because the way we use the word property strategy, we would say, what is your property strategy? And the answer might be to buy to let or to do development. That is not a strategy, that is a technique. And the difference is this. A strategy is about a plan of action that is very specifically designed to achieve a very specific outcome, potentially over the long term. So it's about a plan. A strategy is a plan. So when we say, what is your property strategy? The answer to the plan should be to invest for cash flow. And by that, you mean that what you're going to do is leverage your money in order to get a regular monthly income. Or you might say to invest for capital gain, which is a completely different. This is nothing about a regular monthly income coming in. This is about investing in a lump that you are going to do something to, with the aim of that lump being worth more than it was originally. And then the difference is your gain, your capital gain between the two. Technique, on the other hand, which is what I believe all these so-called property strategies actually are, a technique means a skillful or efficient way of doing something. And that exactly describes what, to my mind, a property technique is. A property technique, for example, like buy to let, is a very skillful way of taking your money, investing it into a property with the sole purpose of the amount charged to borrow that property by somebody else is an X amount more than the cost of you buying and running that property to lend it to somebody else. It's a way of doing the maths, for example, on property development or property trades or flipping, that type of thing, where you are saying that I'm going to buy this property for this amount of money, do this amount of money of work to it so that it will increase in value, such that the increase in value will pay me back my purchase price, my buying costs, my cost to refurb, and give me a very specific return. That would be a technique. So that's what we're going to talk about today. The difference between the two and why it's so important to get it right. And this sort of picks up on last week's talk about women facing financial challenges and how it's so important that we have our own clear and personal financial strategies. So if we take for a minute the economy and just look at the economy, both as our own individual countries and then as part of a wider global economy. The economy goes through, these are sort of standard phrases really, boom and bust, bull markets and bear markets, times of things going very well. And by that, we mean the cost or the value of investments increasing. That would be considered to be a good thing for people. It means that we've got lots of employment. Lots of employment means that we can collect taxes. Taxes mean that we can pay for the running of the country, which means the country is performing well. We can then apply tax relief to certain businesses in order to encourage them to do even better and employ more people, and by employing more people, gain more taxes, and so the cycle goes. If we're not doing particularly well, it's usually triggered by a lack of something. And if we think back to 2008, and I just want to preface this with, I'm not an economist and I'm not a financial advisor, this is just my take on the world. If we go back to 2008, triggered by, do we call it financial improprieties in banks, or is that going too far? Triggered by risky lending practices, okay? So the market had been doing very, very well in 2005, 2006, 2007 onwards. That might not be exactly right on the dates, but around that sort of period, we're starting to see banks are making riskier loans. And what they'd been doing is that they had been lending money to people that could not afford to repay the mortgage. And they were called ninja mortgages, if you remember that far back. No income, no job. So people with no income and no job were borrowing money in order to buy a house to live in, because that seems to be the global dream that everybody wants, to own their own home, which is, I suppose, fair enough. I'm sitting in here owning my own home. There's a whole story and side path we'll go down, but we'll stay with where we are right now. How on earth is somebody with no job and no income going to repay the mortgage? These lenders didn't really worry about that so much, because what they were looking for is that the value of the property was going to increase in such a way that if it got to the stage where these people couldn't borrow money anymore to pay back the loan, it didn't really matter, because they would repossess the house would be worth more, they'd be able to sell it because the market was mad and everybody was buying houses, and they'd be able to sell it for more than they had originally lent in the first place, get back their loan, make a profit. It was almost as if banks were becoming property traders. And then they started to notice that this could be a problem. And so there's something that they do within the markets with a capital M and in inverted commas, where they group together packages of, let me call them investment opportunities, and they sell them as bundles. And these bundles were being put together and they were being named as things and sold as an identity in their own right, whereas really what they were was a bundle of IOUs or mortgages that had been given to people who could never afford to repay the mortgage. And then they were sold to other investors who paid a premium to buy those, and so on and so forth. And I'll talk to you one day about rent to rent and how they started to sell rent to rent options. But that's another story that we will come up with. What they did in the States predominantly, but also in many of the banking sectors, is start selling bad investments. As the investments started to collapse, it had a negative effect on the banks. The banks started to collapse, and then you had Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, particularly in the States, followed by Lehman Brothers and the other names that we know, basically go into liquidation. Now, interestingly, we are just coming out of a period where we have been talking about Silicon Valley Bank collapsing. I'm not going to get into that right now, but you can see how things repeat themselves. And if you look back now, it happened a couple of weeks ago, if you look back now, you'll see the extreme nervousness over the first couple of days when it became clear that the bank was going into collapse, and how quickly the American president stepped in and guaranteed, with government money, guaranteed all of the investments of all of the investors in that bank. And he had to do it for two reasons. One, the investors in that bank were not just ordinary people like you and me, they were tech companies, and the tech companies are the businesses to be watching for the future. Not just because they're the ones that might make a lot of money, because we've got, your Apples, your Facebooks, your Instagrams, Zooms, all of these sorts of companies. And now, of course, we've got GPT through OpenAI, all of these sort of companies going on out there, and there are gazillions of them. So those companies are set to make lots and lots of money, and there will be tax benefits to any government from those companies being successful. There will be employment benefits to any company, any country that has those companies, because they will employ people, and then not only the people are not drawing on benefits and reliant on the government, they're earning money, and then that's providing taxes. But most importantly, and I think this was the prime reason that he did it, if that bank went down, and if we then faced in 2023 the same sort of nervousness that we started to feel in the end of 2007 and early 2008, but particularly 2007, we could have had a global financial crash. Now, that global financial crash is following on from over 12 months now of the Russian war against Ukraine, and only 2 years more since we started COVID. Governments are highly indebted. They have paid out loads of money. What they need now is a calm and growing economy. We need the economy to grow. We need businesses to succeed. We need our residents of our countries to be employed so that they're not a burden on the state. And then we also need them to be earning money so that we can draw taxes off of them. And then that will start to repay the debts and fund growth back in our countries again. That's why he stepped in. Now, that little economic summary that I obviously went into in great deal of detail, because I find all of that fascinating. What has that got to do with where we are right now in property investment? Because whether we're about to face a recession or not, whether we are about to go into boom or bust, in some ways is irrelevant to your strategy, because your strategy, your plan of action, is designed to achieve your long-term, very specific goal. And what I hinted at last week, and what I want to reiterate this week, is that your long-term financial goal needs to be financial security. That will be a different amount of money for all of you. But what it does mean is that you need to look at, in simple terms, how you live now, the money coming in, the money going out, look at the difference. Hopefully you at least break even, if not have savings. What would happen if, and then that's the scenarios that you need to bring into play that I discussed last week. What happens if you lost your job? What happens if you became sick? What happens if you start a family? What happens if your parents become old and need your help? What happens if your children decide to go to university and, require your support for the next 3 years? How are you going to fund those changes that may or may not come up, but something definitely will come up in your future? You need a strategy that can generate income in a way that it can flex with the demands on you through the coming years. Okay, so that's your strategy. That doesn't change whether the economy is doing well or not well. What might change is the numbers within it. So it might be that at the moment, because the economy is doing well, you need 100 units, but if the economy is not doing well, you need 150 units. Or it might be the other way around. At the moment, you need 150 units, but if the economy does particularly well, you only need 100 units. It's a tweak on the detail, but the overall strategy is that you need to do something in order to generate long-term financial security. And obviously what I'm going to talk to you about, the something, is investing in property, because for me, regardless of the economy, regardless of what it's doing, there are two things. The most important thing, we all need somewhere to live, regardless of what the economy is doing. And that is affected by the fact that as human beings, we breed. Thanks to medical care, we live a lot longer, and therefore we have a housing shortage pretty much wherever you are in the world, because we're living longer and we are still fit and healthy and having more children, and therefore our population is growing, but the size of the planet hasn't grown, the size of our individual countries hasn't grown, the size of the ocean hasn't shrunk particularly, other than those little sand islands they're building in the Middle East, but ignore those for now. And therefore, housing is always in demand. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that we are creating a strategy to enable you to have long-term financial security, no matter what happens to you. And so, again, as I said to you, whether the economy changes or the economy doesn't change, we still need to invest in property. There is always going to be a demand for it. And therefore, it is sort of, I wouldn't say it's price impervious to the economy, because we know that house prices go up and down. But what is affecting the house prices going up and down is not the availability of the houses so much as the availability of the money. And that was the point that I was getting to when I wandered off into my whole sidetrack about Fannie Mae, Fannie Mac, and the whole thing with Silicon Valley Bank. If there was a fear that the money available, and this is available in all sorts, it's available for business investment, personal loans, and mortgages. So just generally, if the availability of money was condensed or limited or restrained in any way, and that can be either because there isn't enough money or because the trust between the banks and therefore its ability to circulate isn't there, when we run out of money to borrow, that affects the housing market. And then that either makes the cost of borrowing higher, or it affects the house prices because people can't afford to buy. They can't afford to buy, then the house prices drop. But generally speaking, if you were to look at a graph of house prices over the last, goodness, I don't know, 10, 20, 30 years, there might be a few jaggedy spikes, but it is generally an upward trend. And that's because we live on a limited space planet, and we still breed, and we are being saved by the doctors. So that's still going on. And so your strategy, if it uses property to create financial security for yourself, is actually being founded on, well, a limited resource, if you want to think of it that way around. Properties are a limited resource because until we do like they do in the movies, whenever you see the sci-fi movies, and what we're looking at then is the properties are being, 300 flights high, or they're floating in space, or whatever else they're doing. As long as we're in the real world, and probably our lifetime world, houses tend to be grounded by foundations in the dirt. They go up so far. Yes, a few of them are quite high, but generally they've got to have lifts and they've got to function, but they are still limited to how high they can go. And also, I think probably a bit more Europe and maybe even the States, we're not used to mega high living. Whereas maybe if you went over to the Far East, where land is really condensed, and even the Middle East, they do mega high living. So we're still going to be constrained, and there's still going to be a point where even if we start building every single property over 20 stories high, we're still going to be in a position where sooner or later our ability to breed and be saved by the doctors will outweigh the height of the buildings that we can manufacture. So we are still going to have this issue of houses being a fairly limited resource. Now, if you then get into an investor mindset, that is good. If you're a home buyer thinker, then that's probably less good, because obviously what that means is homes are increasing in price and will at times be almost too much that people can afford to buy them. And then that's why you have problems in the housing market, and why all the papers pick up on it, and why there's all that conversation. But from an investor point of view, all we're doing is a simple equation, which is the price of the house plus the cost to buy that house, added to the cost of any refurbishments that you have to do to that house to make it habitable, plus a 1/12 of the ongoing costs, you know, as you spread it out monthly, all of those costs spread out monthly, the loan, the refurb, the running costs, the buying costs, everything needs to be less than the rent. Well, that's easy. The rent is always going to be more, because otherwise, why would you buy a property, rent it out for less than it's costing you, because you would make a loss? That's not the definition of the word investment by anybody's means. So it's going to be more. Now what you need to do is you need to look at the gap between your costs and your revenue coming in, and that's effectively your profit. How much profit do you need to make? And then if we actually go back up to your plan, how much profit do you need to make on a monthly basis? And I spoke in, and I'll try and keep to this number so that we keep that story running through. I spoke about what if you had £500 a month more? And that £500 a month more, let's just say that that is the rent profit between your costs and your rents being charged per property. So you're going to make 250 units of income per property. And so if you had 2 properties, you'll have 500. If you had 3, you'll have 750. What if you set a strategy that says, I want to generate £500 a month, or $500, whatever, £500 a month extra by investing in property? That's my big plan of action. Now, you'd flesh it out. You talk about over what period and everything else, and then you talk about property. And then what we would do is then we would get down to the technique, and the technique is then what becomes market conditions dependent or market conditions led. So there will be a time, for example, where interest rates are really low and your property has increased in value, your rent has increased in value, you haven't remortgaged the property in a long while, property prices are good, and if you were at this point to remortgage your property, lock it into a 5-year mortgage deal, you could release out, let's just say the number £40,000 or £50,000, and take that money and invest it into another property. Then now your technique would be to go through your existing property portfolio, maybe even your home as well, maybe even following on from last week's, having a conversation with your parents and locking in low rates for the next 5 years and releasing appropriate amounts of equity within your risk profile, and then taking that capital and going out into the market and buying properties that you can then also secure on low interest rates. That would be a very specific market driven strategy, that the interest rates were low, now's a good time to buy. But there is a lot of conversation at the moment in the UK about how shockingly high the Bank of England base rate is. It's climbed to 4%. We were down at a silly 0.5% or whatever. And therefore mortgage costs have increased. And there are a lot of people, myself included, that have been on mortgages up until, let's say, summer 22, where we were looking at maybe around 1 to 2% on a mortgage. And when those mortgage terms, which is the period that the interest rate pricing lasts, that interest rate pricing period came to the end of a 2-year deal or the end of a 3-year deal. And all of a sudden we've come out into a market, particularly the end of 22 in the UK and early 23, where we were looking at 5 or 6% for an interest rate. If you've come out of something that's at 2 and landed into something that's 6, that is a huge difference in cost. And therefore, that will definitely be eating into your profit and affecting the return on your property. And that's a big risk for a lot of people, but it's also something that you can mitigate against. And I'm not going to go into how you mitigate these costs now. The point is that that has then caused people to say, right, I'm going to put my property on the market because I don't want to remortgage into a 6% interest rate and even just pay that for the next 2 years, never mind pay that for the next 5 years. So rather than remortgaging, I'm going to sell, which is what's caused quite a few properties to still come into the market at the moment. So we have supply of properties. When we have supply of properties, we don't necessarily have runaway costs, because remember, price increases are caused by a lack of supply, obviously coupled with there being a demand, but you very rarely have an oversupply of something and no demand at all. There'll be some demand. So what we're looking at the moment is there's plenty of supply in the market. There is some nervousness in some landlords that are overstretched. They're selling, and if they're in the selling mode, they're not in the buying mode. And so then there are less people looking to necessarily buy. And therefore, those, not glut, but that supply of property that is in the market is now not increasing on a daily basis, because the demand is so high. The demand is moderate, the supply is slightly more than the demand, and therefore we're holding the price down. And that's good news, because now is the time to invest in property. Because what you can do is you can buy now when there aren't a lot of people around. You can use, once you understand how to, you can use the information at your fingertips in order to secure good prices, to make offers on property. And what you're actually doing then is you are buying a property that is cheaper than it will be in 10 years, probably even cheaper than it will be in 5 years. Yes, you might be paying what feels like a high interest rate, but remember how I just told you that story about Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and the Silicon Valley Bank. Here we are in 2023 with Silicon Valley Bank and interest rates, mortgage interest rates, let's just say they're hovering around the 5 at a moment. If we go back in time to when Freddie Mae and Fannie Mac, or the other way, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac collapsed, we were looking at mortgage rates and the Bank of England base rate. Again, they were all around the 4, 5, 6%. Now that's odd. So that's what I mean about that circle. I started investing in 2008 when the interest rates were as they are now. So you can invest in property at any time, regardless of what the economy is doing. The only thing that you do differently is you look at the technique that you are using. You don't change your strategy. Your strategy, if this is what your strategy is to take your savings and to leverage them through a use of a mortgage in order to generate long-term financial security for yourself. You can keep doing that regardless of the technique, because your technique may adapt to the market. So I hope that makes sense. A strategy is your overall plan. Your overall plan doesn't change in terms of its big objective. What you might do is you might change the amount, and you might decide in 3 years' time to revise your strategy and say, it's not that I want 500 units a month, I now want 600 units a month. It would be extremely unlikely you would ever reduce the price. You might say that I want 750 units a month. That's absolutely fine. Then what you can do is, instead of buying 2 houses at 250, you buy 3 houses at 250, and you hit your target of 750 income a month. Your strategy pretty much stays the same once you get it right and once you establish it. And if you want help with that, I'm here to have a conversation with you. That won't be a problem. The technique of how you make your time, your money, your resources achieve your strategy, achieve your plan for you, is what changes. And that changes as the economic environment changes, as house price changes, as houses become available or not available, as even sometimes certain legislation is brought into effect, and that affects the housing market. So we had a spell back in the UK where back in George Osborne's time, let me see how long ago this was, maybe 2016 to 2018, somewhere along there, introduced something called Section 24, which made it so that instead of keeping properties in your private name, it became better financially to keep them in a limited company if you were going to invest in property for the long term. The overall strategy would have remained the same. You still want to generate 500 or 750 units of income a month. But now what happens is, instead of buying in your personal name, you buy them into a limited company. So your technique has changed, not the overall goal. And you need to understand that, and you need to get clear on what your strategy is. And I have had many people come to me over the years and say things like, and I always remember this one, a young guy saying to me, okay, so what is it that you want to do? I want to invest in property. Fabulous. Have you had any thoughts about this? What it is exactly that you were thinking of? Yes, I want 100 houses. Okay. What sort of 100 houses do you want? I want 100 houses that are all going to be HMOs, houses of multiple occupancy. Fabulous. Okay, so you've got your technique down. Why is that? What do you mean, why is that? Well, why do you want 100 HMOs? Well, because it sounds like a nice number. Okay, so the overall strategy is to get 100 houses because it sounds like a nice number. Have you looked at the income potential? Have you looked at the cost potential? Have you looked at the impact on your time? And after we spoke for a bit, what it was in the long run, and again, sometimes this is very often a male answer rather than a female answer, because he wanted to spend more time with his family. I will refer you back to episode 1 and the financial provider avatar that I spoke to you about. He wanted to spend more time with his family, but he was going to invest in 100 properties. And not only were they going to be 100 properties, they were going to be 100 houses of multiple occupants. So if we just took them as 4 per property, instead of having 100 houses and 100 tenancy agreements, he was going to have 100 houses and 400 tenancy agreements. And that was his plan for having more time with his family. It wasn't, of course it wasn't, because he hadn't put the two together. He'd been thinking about a technique, thinking a technique was a strategy, but not having a clear idea of what his goal was all the way along. And when we started to break this down and we looked at how much money was required per property, how long it would take him to generate, and let's just generally call this amount of money a deposit, how much money it would cost him in order to get these deposits together to buy each one of these properties. He was going to have to live 4 lifetimes in order to get it. There was no way that he, even with the exponential use of the rental income that he was generating, that he was going to get himself 100 properties. And I mean, exaggerated, because it wasn't going to take him 4 lifetimes, but definitely longer than the 1 lifetime that he had at the starting point he was at. What we then did is turn it the other way around. Okay, I'm not saying you can't have that. Let's just park it for a minute and let's ask the question the other way around. What you want to do is have more time with your family. How might that look? Well, I work in my business at the moment. Would you like to have a day off a week? Yeah, that would be perfect. So then what you can do is you can have 4-day working week and a 3-day weekend. Would that work for you? Yes, that would be great. What do we need to do in order to fill that 1-day gap of not getting an income from your business, not working on your business? What would that look like? We established what that gap was in terms of a financial amount. We then looked at the number of properties required to fill that gap and then added in a bit of contingency, which is what we'll always do, but I'm not talking about the contingencies now. Let's look at the set amounts, and let's just say that what he needed in order to break out from that was 2,000 units more of income, and let's call that 8 houses. And this was 8 simple buy-to-lets would give him, and I remember this so clearly, from wanting 100 multiple occupancy houses, which was 400 tenancies. And these people in houses of multiple occupancy, shared houses, they turn over on a regular basis. At least one of those tenants was going to move out each year. Every single year, he was going to have to find 100 tenants for his properties, minimum. That's move out, move in, do all of the changeover, maybe do some refurb in the middle. That all affected the costs and the profits coming out of the business. And instead, 8 simple family lets would have helped him meet his strategic goal. We could then build on that so that he had surplus, he had extra. That wasn't the problem. But all of a sudden, something that was almost unachievable became achievable, because we split apart, we combed apart and separated out the word strategy from technique. Property technique is buy to let, buy to sell, develop, trade, lease option, rent to rent, etc., etc. Those are techniques. Strategy is your overall goal. Your strategy isn't even that you will buy, remortgage, or buy, refurb, remortgage, which is what frequently people talk about. Oh, what's your strategy? Buy, refurb, remortgage. Or your strategy isn't buy 3, keep 2, or buy 3, keep 1. That's not the strategy. That's a technique. Your strategy is, what is it that you want property to do for you? And thinking about why you want property to do it for you really helps you add color to the strategy. And then out of that, let's see what's the right way to do it at the moment. And then let's see what you might change to in a year or 2 years from now. And let's see what you might be doing in 5 years from now. But right now, this is the goal, and the goal's going to stay all the way along the top, and you might just tweak it and improve it as you move through life, make it grow, if you like, grow your strategy, grow your goal. But your techniques are going to be market led and supportive of the strategy. So I hope that that's really given you some thought. My name's Vicky Boucher. This is A Wealthy Life. And we've been talking about property investment, and the importance of understanding the difference between strategy versus technique, and why, if you don't get that right, you could get yourself in a whole pickle. And so next week, what I'm going to do is just go into a bit more about some of these various techniques and talk to you about those. I discuss them a lot in my book called Using Other People's Money, How to Invest in Property. And then the week after, I'm actually going to go into a case study for you and explain the difference between the first solo purchase that I created and the first flip that I did, and how effectively using 2 different techniques, but almost it looks the same on the surface, things went wrong and the outcomes were very different. And so getting those techniques aligned with the strategy is very, very important. So I wish you well. I hope that I have been able to inspire you, educate you, and put some whoosh into your life. Thank you very much for listening. Please remember to follow along, to like, to leave a review, and I'll speak to you next week.